Welcome to another episode of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Heshi from Borough Park in appreciation for the Yad Hashem throughout history. If anyone would like to sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast, please email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or check out the notes and information in the show's notes below. This episode and the forthcoming few episodes will be 3 weeks themed, so to speak, things that are related to 3 weeks or just tragedies throughout Jewish history, as is appropriate for this time of the year. Starting with this episode, which is appropriate, I think, for this week, because this episode is about England's Jews in the medieval period until their expulsion from England, which took place. The decree was on July 18th, 1290, so we just passed the anniversary on the English date, as well as that was actually Tisha B'Av, which is coming up. And England's history at the time is, for those that are familiar, and as you'll hear more in the podcast, really not great for the Jews. There was the blood libels, and there was massacres of the Jews, a number of them. And so when it culminated in the expulsion in 1290. So for that reason, I thought it would be appropriate to release this episode now. And stay tuned for the forthcoming episodes that are kind of related to the 3 weeks. If you would like to subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new Sfarim and books and that sort of thing, or the Sfarim Chatter Substack, YouTube, and so on, the links, you can find links and information in the show's notes below. Also, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, whether you listen on 24/6, Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. And as well as there'll be a link in the show's notes that you can purchase the book if you're so interested. And please enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor John Tolan, who is Professor of History at the University of Nantes in France and a member of the Academia Europaea. And we'll be discussing his relatively new book titled England's Jews, Finance, Violence, and the Crown in the 13th Century, basically discussing the Jews of England until the expulsion of 1290. So the time of the Rishonim, the medieval time, there was Jews in England, and there was not for a gap of a few centuries, as we will discuss here. So thank you, Professor Tolan, for joining me.
Thank you.
Let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I'm originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I've been did a BA at Yale in classics, where I learned Latin and Greek, and then I went on and got a PhD at the University of Chicago in medieval history. And I was interested for my dissertation. I worked on an interesting character named Petros Alfonsi, who was a Jew from Al-Andalus, from Muslim Spain, who had an education in Hebrew, and who had studied astronomy and other sciences. And then he migrated to the north of Spain, converted to Christianity, and wrote polemics against Judaism and Islam. He translated scientific works from Arabic into Latin. And he also came to France and northern England, where he taught astronomy. So he was an interesting character between cultures, between a Jew who converted to Christianity, who had lived in Muslim France, and like many converts, polemicized against his old religion. So this project, this dissertation, got me interested in the history of relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, particularly in the Middle Ages.
So how did you come to England Jews? Like I said, that he traveled to England, but then you now live in France, you're a professor in France. How did you come to write a book on the history of the early English Jews?
Well, I had a few years ago, I had a major research project financed by the European, which was called Relman, on the the legal status of religious minorities in the medieval world. And we looked at legal texts about the status of Jews living in Christian or Muslim lands, of Christians living in Muslim lands, of Muslims living in Christian lands in the Middle Ages. So I had a whole team of postdocs and doctoral students who are working on sources in Hebrew and Arabic and Latin and other languages. And I became intrigued with this history of English Jews, among other things, because there are a lot of sources. My previous work has been more focused on Mediterranean Europe. And in England in the 13th century, there are a lot of sources, not that many of them in Hebrew, but many Latin sources that have to deal with contracts that have to do with legal law cases and other legal proceedings undertaken by Jews or involving Jews. And there's a number of narrative sources, particularly in Latin and French, that deal with the history of Jews. So I was invited in 2013 to spend some time at the Katz Center for Jewish Studies in Philadelphia. And this center has a theme every year. And the theme that year was Jews in 13th century medieval Europe. So I got in discussing these questions with colleagues there, I got the idea of writing a book on the situation of the Jews in England in the 13th century.
So let's talk about the Jews of England. Especially before we get to the 13th century, we should discuss the origins of the Jews of England. So when do Jews and how do they first come to England?
Well, there's little or no evidence of Jewish presence in England before the 11th century. And in 1066 is the year of the Norman conquest, when William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, who had a claim to the throne of England, came to reinforce his claim and conquered England. And we know that in the years following his conquest in 1066, he had Jews from Normandy, from the city of Rouen, his capital in Normandy, come to London. And that these Jews were already involved in money lending, and that in the subsequent decades, he and his successors allowed Jews to settle in other major towns of the kingdom. And eventually, Jewish lenders developed a monopoly, were given a royal monopoly on lending at interest.
So, first of all, you mentioned London. Was London the capital of England that time, or was it still Winchester?
Yes, it was. It was, yeah.
Oh, so it had moved from Winchester already to London.
Yes.
So, essentially, you talk throughout the book a lot about the King's Jews. If you want to explain what that means, and this is why this term comes from.
Well, the various kings, particularly starting with King Stephen, and later on, what I look at, much of the book focuses on the long reign of Henry III, who became king in 1217 and was king until his death in 1272. And he refers to his Jews. And the idea is he and some of his predecessors had affirmed a royal monopoly on sovereignty over Jews, which was a double-edged sword for English Jews, because it meant that they depended directly on the king. They were free from any control by the nobility, by the church, and the king offered them protection. But as we'll see, sometimes this protection was, in this close relationship, was a double-edged sword, because the king, since they were his Jews, supposedly, he could tax them at will, whereas other members of the English community, other of his subjects, he had to get permission from them collectively in order to impose new taxes. He could impose taxes on Jews on his will. And also, when revolts erupted later in the reign of Henry III, because he was a very unpopular king for reasons we will see, it was easy to attack the Jews who were considered close to the king and his agents.
Now, how does this differ? How is this similar to the Jews in other countries at the time? Let's say France or other countries with a king. Was that the same, or was that different? Were the Jews different there?
It was a little different. For example, in France at the same time, is Louis IX, who's king of France, and he issues restrictive legislation on Jews living in France, on Jewish money lending. But the Jews of France are not all dependent on the king. Some of them are dependent on their local lords. So it's a quite different system.
Okay, so in general, as you mentioned, the Jews originally came to London. Where did the Jews live throughout these? It's not a long time span, as you say. We know of them from the mid 11th century, and then they're expelled at the end of the 13th. So these 200 years, let's call it for simplicity's sake in the podcast. Where did they live generally, and what were their professions?
So they lived in some of the principal towns of England. So they lived in places like Oxford, Lincoln, Canterbury, York, and we know that these towns were documented. Some Jews were living outside of the permitted areas, but most of them lived in towns where they were officially recognized as having a right to live. The royal officers, the sheriffs, were charged with their protection, and there were officers. There was a special exchequer of the Jewry. These were officers who oversaw the Jewish communities in the name of the king, and they oversaw in particular the lending system, because, as I said, gradually Jews developed an almost monopoly on lending money with interest. And this was something that was closely controlled and heavily taxed by the crown. So there was, in each of these principal towns where there were Jews, there would be an arca, literally a chest that contained records of loans. And for each loan that was made, there would be a document in 3 parts that would be cut. One part would go to the lender, one part would go to the creditor, and one part would go into this arca where these records were centralized. So we have a series of these documents in Latin, often with Hebrew signatures.
Now, and due to the nature of being before computers or cloud services, even though there was 3 of these, we'll see when there were riots or whatever there would be, if they would get a hold of these and burn them or get rid of them, then the debt would go away, so to speak.
Right, and that's one of the things that as a number of lesser gentry get into debt to Jewish lenders, some of them, particularly in moments of social unrest and during some of the rebellions against King Henry III, they'll attack Jewish communities. There are a number of Jews who died, perhaps several hundred in London in 1264, when rebels take over the city of London, and similar massacres are on a smaller scale in other towns. And often, not only Jews themselves are targeted, but the records of these loans will be taken and burned.
So, were there any, you said the Jews kind of had this monopoly on money lending, because Christians, I guess, were not allowed to because of a prohibition against usury with the church. Did the Jews, were they involved in any other professions, or that was mainly the Jewish profession in England at the time?
Well, the Jews were involved in other professions. And again, historians were all sort of dependent on our documentation. And there's not that much documentation for Jews in other professions. But we know that in these communities, there were people who did various other professions, often involving trade, but also more modest professions in an urban environment.
Okay, so some other couple of general questions before we get to some specifics. And you mentioned where they live. We didn't mention, I think I mentioned Norwich, and Isaac of Norwich will, the rich Jew. And there's a lot to say about him. We'll get there in a minute. I just want to ask you, first of all, generally, what was the contact between Jews and Christians? You said that's something that you're interested in and you research. What was the contact between Jews and Christians, and were there attempts to limit that, especially from the Christian side? Those are the sources we have in England at the time.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And that's, as I said, historians are dependent on their sources. And there's not a lot of sources about that kind of day-to-day contact. And what we do have is largely negative. For example, a rabbi who writes that he heard that Jews in England are drinking beer with their Christian neighbors, and they shouldn't be doing this. He said, on the other hand, maybe we should be indulgent because if they didn't accept a drink with their neighbors, it might cause friction with them. So better to have a drink times and time and have a good relationship with your neighbors, even if you're doing something you're not really supposed to do. So we have a few rabbinic sources that are along those lines. And then a lot of Christian sources, particularly documents from church councils and bishops, where one of their big issues was trying to prevent Christians from working in Jewish houses, particularly young women who could be working as maids and could be vulnerable. That vulnerability could lead either to sexual contact or even worse from the church's point of view, from apostasy, from these people converting to Judaism. So there were attempts by various bishops and church councils to prohibit this practice, to prohibit day-to-day contact between Jews and Christians. For example, there was a bishop of Hereford in the west of England who in 1286 wrote a letter. He was out of town. He wrote a letter to his subordinate saying, hey, I've heard that one of the prominent Jews in the city is throwing a wedding party for his grandson, and then he's invited his Christian neighbors. But this is prohibited. You have to tell those Christians that they can't go and celebrate that marriage with these Jews. And then a week later, we have a second letter from the same bishop, and he's furious because actually lots of Christians went to the wedding, they danced, they drank, they toasted to the long life of the bride and groom. And the bishop says, this is things they're not supposed to do. The Jews are supposed to be inferior. You're supposed to avoid unnecessary contact with them. So we have plenty of evidence of this kind of daily contact, but it's mostly negative evidence from people who are trying to limit or prohibit it.
Now, you mentioned something interesting there about the influence of the church. So at this point, I think it's like 1534, Henry VIII splits off the English church. Is that when they split off from the Catholic Church? So at this point, they're still under the sway of the Pope and of the Catholic Church in England. So even though there's the Archbishop of Canterbury, he has a big position there, but it's kind of different. So what kind of, as you mentioned, we should mention the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, and that kind of influences England. But even though the church has that, and there's certain regulations on Jews, like they have to wear certain things on their clothing, badges of identification. And listeners are familiar with the yellow star, which is not in England. We can mention what they wore in England. Something else, the luchas, the tablets. But that wasn't just because the in Rome they said that. That's not necessarily what happened in the country. So what kind of influence does it have in England, and what happens in England? What do they implement? What does the church there implement on the Jews?
Yeah. One of the things when we deal with medieval society, of course, the church is everywhere, but the church is not monolithic. Obviously, the church is composed of a lot of men and women. There's the Pope, there are different bishops, and the bishops are supposedly subordinate to the popes, but they have their own agendas, as do Franciscan friars or other institutions. But what we see, and the example you raise is an interesting one. There's a Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 held in Rome, in which the Pope Innocent III tries to impose a program of reform. And there are 70 canons or laws that this council proclaims, and several of them have to do with Jews who live in Europe, limiting the interest they can charge on loans, prohibiting them from holding positions of authority over Christians. And one that particularly interested me was the rule that Jews and Muslims living in Christian territories had to wear distinctive clothing, and they had to do that in order that Christians would know who was a Jew, who was a Muslim, and would avoid sexual contact with them. So this was a way, let's have everybody dress differently so we know who's whom, and there's no excuse for sexual intimacy between Christians and non-Christians. Now, of course, this was proclaimed by the Church Council, presided by the Pope, but they had no authority to force secular rulers to make such legislation and to enforce it. But the first monarch to do so 3 years later was King Henry III. Now, King Henry III at that point was an only 11-year-old boy, so we can assume it wasn't his idea, this law, but probably the idea that since he was underage, there was a regency council of 3 men that were ruling England in his name. And one of them was a guy named Gualabicchieri, who was the papal legate, in other words, the representative of the Pope in England, at a time when England was supposedly a papal fief. In other words, the king took obeisance to the Pope in order to receive the title of king. And Gualabicchieri believed in this reform movement promoted by the Pope Innocent III. He had been at this Fourth Lateran Council. And so he was probably the one who inspired this legislation signed in the name of Henry III, obliging all Jews to wear a badge. As you said, it's in the form of tablets, white badges in the form of the tablets that Moses received on Sinai. And again, it's not said that this is to avoid sexual intimacy, but clearly it's to keep Jews visible and separate from Christians. But what's interesting is we have some financial documents for 3 years later, 1221, in which a number of Jews paid, in some cases, considerable amounts of money in order not to wear these badges, which means that the law isn't being completely enforced, obviously, but as often, this sort of law is used as a way for the king or the council who's ruling in his name to enforce their power. We have the power over these Jews who are the king's Jews, as we've seen, and also to obtain money. The king is always short on funds, so if he can use this to get money from his Jews, all the better. And of course, a lot of the people in the church, some of the bishops, weren't very happy about this because they wanted to see this legislation enforced. So they tried to reissue church canons, try to make Christians, since the church doesn't have any legislation, any jurisdiction over Jews, they tried to prevent Christians from selling food to Jews. They figure, well, if we can prevent Christians from selling food to Jews, then the Jews will have to comply and they'll have to wear their badges. Except the Jews from Lincoln and other towns complained to King Henry III, who ordered that everyone must sell to Jews as usual. And if anyone refuses to sell to Jews, he should be put in jail. So you see this confrontation between the king and these bishops over how Jews had to live in Christian society, whether they had to wear this badge or not.
Which is very interesting. I mean, and in general, the way that the Church's attitude, the Church of England's attitude towards the Jews, and as we've said, it's not the Church of England yet. It's still under the, still Catholic, but it's, as you know, as you mentioned, the bishops have their own power, and it's far from Rome, so it's kind of its own church. And we can mention the Archbishop of Canterbury, and as you talk about in the book, Stephen Langton and Robert Grosseteste, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, in Oxford, and what kind of their attitude in generally is towards the Jews.
Well, it can vary from person to person, and considering the circumstances. Robert Grosseteste was Bishop of Lincoln. Before that, he was Chancellor of the University of Oxford, and he had wrote several things on Jews. He wrote he was close to a Baron Simon, Earl of Leicester, who had expelled the Jews from the town of Leicester. And he wrote, and some of these Jews took refuge in a neighboring town. And Robert Grosseteste wrote to the Duchess of this neighboring town saying, I heard you received the Jews, and you should just make sure that they don't do any lending of interest. They should be working with their hands. So in this text, you have the impression that he would want to prohibit loans with interest. But when he was later Chancellor of Oxford and Bishop of Lincoln, he didn't try to prohibit such loans. He only tried, because at the University of Oxford, Jewish lending was played an important role. Jews served as landlords, to a number of students in the new university, and they also lent money to students and to faculty. So Robert Grosseteste had from a practical point of view, knew this lending was necessary, but he tried to keep rates low. So you have this ambivalence, and then the same Robert of Grosseteste later wrote about Judaism and Judaism's relations with Christianity, and he affirmed later in his life that actually, in several works, he affirmed that actually Jews knew that Jesus was the Messiah who was promised to them, but out of pride and out of malice, they pretended they didn't know that Jesus was the Messiah. So you have this sort of, here's one of the great minds of 13th century England, but he, in the end of his life, proffering what are basically what we would call conspiracy theories about how Jews of Jesus's time knew that Jesus was God and the Son of God, but they hid this truth from other Jews.
Yeah, kind of a classic, like I said, conspiracy theory, anti-Jewish.
Exactly.
I want to mention something about Stephen Langton and what story he plays here. Also, just something interesting about him. I've seen this. Maybe you can confirm this or not. That the Chumash, the Bible, is separated into chapters, prakim, right? And I've seen that he was the one that this came from him. Is that accurate? It comes from Langton.
I don't know. He's. I mean, there were certainly different ways of dividing the Bible for Christian study, and he was. Before he became Archbishop of Canterbury, he was a prominent intellectual at the University of Paris. So he certainly did a lot of commentaries on the Bible.
Yeah, and you discuss some of them in the book. I mean, what kind of role does he play in the story of the Jews? And to be clear, we discussed Langton, Grosseteste. We're here in the early mid 13th century, and this is the beginning of the end for the Jews, because in 1290 they're going to be expelled. So these figures. Right. This is important here. It's not like a long way away. It's a few decades away from when they're going to be expelled.
Yeah. Langton is Archbishop. He was the one who called a council of the English Church in 1222, which tried to apply to England the reforms that had been decided by the Lateran Council in Rome 7 years earlier, including the question of badges, of Jews wearing badges, which he tried to enforce, but as we've seen, Henry III wasn't having anything of it. The council also tried to prohibit Christians from working in Jewish homes, but that again was quite ineffective. But there's this clear idea from Langton and from other bishops that close daily contact with Jews was harmful to Christians.
Right. Okay. So let's now mentioned before Isaac of Norwich to discuss a specific figure, and then we also have to discuss King Henry III, who rules for about 56 years or something, a long time, a very long time, and then his son Edward is the one who expels the Jews. So we'll right. get to them. I just want to talk about Isaac of Norwich a little bit and the powerful Jews and rich Jews, and you use the first chapter of the book through using him as like an
example.
Yeah, an example. I don't know the right word. It's an example of the Jews of England, even though he was the most prominent and influential. Right. He was jailed. He was fined. So talk a little bit about Isaac and the Jews.
So Isaac interests me because he was a very important moneylender, important figure in the Jewish community, and because there's a lot of documentation about him. We know that he came from a family of lenders. His father and his uncle were both prominent Jews in Norwich in the 12th century. And when Isaac was a young boy in 1189, 1190, there was a series of massacres of Jews in different towns of England, including Norwich. And fortunately, most of the Norwich Jews were protected by the sheriff. They went into the royal castle, and we know that Isaac was there with his father and uncle, and presumably the rest of his family, safe while several other Jews in Norwich were killed by mobs. So he learned early on the dangers of being Jewish in England. He went on to, after particularly his father and his uncle's death, to take over much of their business and to become the richest and most prominent, or at least one of the most prominent Jewish moneylenders in England. And in 1210, King John was looking to raise money and raised an exceptional tallage. Now, tallage is a special tax that was levied on Jews. And the story goes, at least as one chronicler reports it, we know that a number of prominent Jews were thrown into prison to try to force them to pay. Several escaped and went to France. And the story is that Isaac was put in prison, and one tooth was pulled each day until he agreed to pay an exorbitant sum. Now, we don't know whether this is one chronicle. We don't know if this is true or not. But if it was true, he had a major hole in his teeth, which would have been a painful reminder of the persecution that prominent Jews could face in England. He was then freed 1217, because in 1217, in the meantime, there had been a revolt, which historians call the First Barons' War, against King John. Finally, the royal forces won, but King John had meantime died, and Henry III in 1217 became king at the age of 9 years old, and the regency freed Isaac, gave him letters of security, in other words, allowing him to return to Norwich and to resume his lending activities and to start collecting the loans that were due to him. And the regency around Henry III realized that their persecution of the Jews had not been helpful to their finances, and that they needed to allow these Jewish lenders to start business again so that they could then tax it. So Isaac resumed his activities, became one of the most prominent Jewish lenders in England, and developed close relations with some of the important people advising Henry III, including one of the members of his Regency Council, which was Bishop Peter of Winchester. And at one point, we even have a record. Again, I spent a lot of time going through financial records and court records, and there's a letter explaining that Isaac paid for 12,000 fish to be sent to Peter during Lent, so that he could distribute the fish to his flock in his bishopric. So we have other evidence that Peter petitioning the king to reduce the amount of tallage that Isaac had to pay. And later in Isaac's life, when he was becoming elderly, Peter wrote to the king and said, "You shouldn't make him come to London every year to pay his tax. You should let him send it from Norwich." So you have this picture, and again, pieced together through letters and bits of administrative documents, because Isaac didn't write anything himself other than signing, not that we know of at least, other than signing some of these contracts.
Okay, so this is, I guess, somewhat well-known, unfortunate aspect of the Jews of England was the pogroms and the killing of a lot of Jews that happened. And we can talk about, pulling back a little bit to York in 1190, the Jews are killed. I think that's right. Is that when it occurs? I think
yes.
And there are Bali Taisvis that live there. Yom Tov of Joigny, how to pronounce his name. He's there, and he writes. He writes the liturgy. They all are killed or suicide in the tower. And then later on, there's William of Norwich. England is, I think, kind of the unfortunate origin of the blood libel and ritual murder.
Right.
And then you get to William of Norwich, and then we get to Hugh of Lincoln with King Henry. Right. So putting you aside for a second, because that we have to discuss with King Henry III. But what about? Do you have anything to say about William of Norwich, the blood libel, and as well as the pogrom? I guess best way to call it, the in York? What happens in York in 1190?
Yeah, what happens in York in 1190 is one of a number of massacres. As I mentioned, there was one in Norwich, which was much smaller. Isaac was safe in the royal castle there. It all started at the coronation of King Richard I in London, when there apparently the one of the chroniclers says that Jews and women were prohibited from attending the ceremony, but that after the ceremony, there was a group of Jews who came to the banquet to present the new king with gifts. And either they didn't understand that they weren't invited, or somebody thought that they were not invited to the banquet either. At any rate, they were attacked, and this then led to a generalized massacre of Jews in London. And Richard the new king, responded rather meekly. He announced that the Jews shouldn't be attacked; they should be protected, but he didn't punish any of the perpetrators of this violence. Then Richard was off on his way to the crusade, what the historians call the Third Crusade, and in his absence, there were a number of anti-Jewish incidents, some of them provoked by crusaders who were mustering in different towns, and York was the largest of these. And indeed, many of the Jews in York ended up committing suicide so as not to be killed or forcibly converted by the Christians.
Yeah, and Richard, you're talking about as King Richard the Lionheart.
That's right.
Yeah, no, and I said, so their kind of first blood libel is William of Norwich, right?
Right.
And then we get to, go ahead.
So yeah, William of Norwich, 1141, and William is a young boy whose body is found in the woods. No one knows how he died. Was it murder? Was it an accident? Was it suicide? But at least one member of his family accuses the local Jews of having killed him. The accusation really doesn't go anywhere. There's no violence that we know of against the Jews because of this. But there is an attempt to create a cult. So one of the local monks writes a hagiographical account of the supposed murder of William. And then this text begins to circulate a little bit. And there are similar charges made in other places in France and in England. And then the major account, as you mentioned, is with little Hugh of little Saint Hugh of Lincoln in 1255.
Yeah, so we should go there. I don't know if you want to discuss Henry at all. Before we go to you, maybe we should detour. I know we haven't really discussed Henry III. And as you said, he takes the throne as a young boy, and he rules for 56 years. So talk a little bit about Henry III and his relationship with his Jews, the king's Jews, so to speak, before we get to this, Hugh of Lincoln, which is a, major turning point, and especially for his relationship with the Jews, I guess I would call it.
Mm-hmm. So Henry becomes king, as I mentioned, at the age of 9 in 1217. And in the early years of his reign, it's relatively speaking, a pretty good time for England's Jews because they're able to start practicing business again. They're able to travel. We have lots of records showing some of them becoming successful and wealthy. But then starting around 1240, Henry starts taxing them more and more heavily for several reasons, one of which is that Henry was fighting. Now, traditionally, the English kings had controlled much of what's now France, Normandy, Aquitaine, Poitou, and Henry's father, King John, had lost Normandy. Henry wanted to get it back. He also wanted to affirm his control of Poitou against his rival, King Louis IX. He also was offered the chance by the Pope to give the crown of Sicily to his son Edmund, and so he was involved in a lot of expensive military adventures in the continent. He failed miserably in almost all of them, and so this created resentment among his subjects, who felt like, not only we have a king that's always losing wars, but we're having to pay out of the nose, so to speak, in order to finance those wars. And then one of these, excuse me. So Henry III was in deep financial trouble because of his failed military adventures in Europe, and he tried to find money wherever he could. He tried to impose new taxes on the church, on laymen, and also on his Jews. So there were some very heavy tallages or taxes on Jews starting in the 1240s, which meant that in the period between the 1240s and the 1260s, many wealthy Jews lost much of their money. And it also meant that when they had to pay these important tallages, they didn't necessarily have the cash at hand in order to do this. So they had to sell their loans off to Christians, often prominent Christians close to the king. And these people, and of course, they had to sell them at a discount. So these people made a lot of money, and these people also managed to take a lot of the land that these borrowers had mortgaged to the Jewish lenders. So this created both a difficult situation for the Jewish lenders, who were short of cash and who were losing money on some of their transactions. And it also created a lot of resentment from some of the borrowers who found themselves losing their land to the barons who had taken over these debts. So this led to a quite difficult situation for England's Jews. And some Jews had even petitioned the king in 1255 to leave the kingdom, and he had refused.
I mean, he didn't allow them to go when later on they're going to be expelled shortly after. But here they were not allowed to leave.
Yes. 25 years later, they'll be expelled.
So let's talk about Hugh of Lincoln. As you mentioned, little Saint Hugh of Lincoln. What happens there, and the Henry's involvement and 30 Jews being killed, and it's just a bad situation.
Yeah. So Hugh is another one of these cases where you have a young boy whose body was found. First, he disappeared. Then eventually his body was found, and some of the people accused Jews of having killed him. And his mother was convinced that the Jews had killed her son. She went and found King Henry III, who was in Scotland at the time, and asked him to intervene. And Henry, on his way back down to London, stopped in Lincoln, had a trial, and one of the prominent Jews, a certain Copin, had apparently confessed under torture, and he exposed this, what was supposedly a plot of Jews to come together and seize this Christian boy and crucify him. Now, we have various texts in French and in Latin that describe what these Jews supposedly did to little Saint Hugh. The boy's body is buried in Lincoln Cathedral. The hagiographical sources claim that he does miracles. Meanwhile, Henry returns to London with a number of Lincoln's Jews, has 19 of them hanged in London. Then at some point, the Franciscan and Dominican friars intervene, and they say to the king that this is not something that Jews do. They managed to obtain the freedom for the other Lincoln Jews that had been imprisoned. But this is one of a series of these accusations of ritual murder. But this is the first one in which a king actually intervenes and gives royal caution to this accusation. So Henry, who was supposedly the protector of the Jews, has become their persecutor. So it's very bad news for Jews in Lincoln and for Jews everywhere in the kingdom. Nevertheless, life continues for these other English Jews until, as I said, a few years later, there's revolt against Henry, erupts into civil war. And that's, as I said earlier, when there are a number of attacks on Jewish communities in order, a number of the rebels are in debt to Jewish lenders, so they kill Jews, they destroy the records. Some Jews in London and again, the chronicles differ, anywhere from 40 to several hundred Jews were killed. Others took refuge in the Tower of London and remained safe there. And after the failure of the rebels in the Civil War, the king reissued charters guaranteeing the Jews their rights and their safety and so forth. But they never fully recovered from this violence. And still being heavily taxed, they were less and less able to pay the taxes that Henry and then his son, Edward I, demanded. So they eventually persecuted, decimated, now poor. They were dispensable from the point of view of King Edward I, who expelled them in 1290.
Yeah, and that's kind of the end until Menachem ben Israel petitions Oliver Cromwell in the mid-17th century. But just one general question before we wrap up is, why the sudden turn by Henry III in this anti-Jewish or anti-Semitism? I discussed a little bit in the introduction to anti-Jewish and anti-Semitism. You mentioned that. I don't know if we have to get into that here, but why do we have any idea why the sudden turn?
It's hard to say. People have said that Henry was a very pious man and that apparently he believed this accusation. He believed this Hugh's mother. It does seem like a tremendous turn, because even a few years earlier, he had participated. There's an inquiry by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II into similar claims, and Frederick had asked for Jewish converts to Christianity to come from all over Europe and testify, and all these converts, including the ones that Henry had sent from England, said, no, Jews don't do this. Jews don't kill people and don't use their blood for ritual purposes. But even so, Henry was ready to believe these accusations. So it's quite unclear to me why he has this turn, but clearly it's very bad for the English Jews.
Okay, and so I'll link the book in the show's notes for those interested. They can check it out. But kind of finally, why do you see this as relevant now that Jews are back in England? And what kind of relevancy does this, besides for an unfortunate period, I guess, in Jewish history? There's a lot of negative here. But what is that? What kind of relevance do you see from reading this today?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a good question, and I would stress that it's easy to trace a negative history. We've been insisting on a lot of negative things today, but also one of the things I tried to do is restore a more balanced vision of how Jews contributed actively to English society in helping finance building projects, the colleges of Oxford, and so forth. And there was this evidence, as I said, day-to-day contact of Jews and Christians going to weddings together, having their children play together, and so forth. So it's not all as dark as it might seem. But this seems, we're talking a lot today about decolonializing history and changing the historical narrative regarding, dark moments of our past, like our involvement in slavery and so forth. And I think this fits into the same thing. The far-right groups don't want us to acknowledge the diversity and complexity of our history. But there's a group called the British Movement in 2015, some of their members went to Lincoln, and they wanted to worship St. Hugh in his tomb. Well, the tomb is no longer there. It was removed in 1955, and replaced by a plaque which explained that these rumors were false and that Hugh was not killed by Jews. But these right-wing, extreme right nationalists weren't having any of it. For them, Hugh was a saint, and he was proof that the Jews were malevolent to Christians. So we see that these medieval legends, which seem so far back, so far from us and so distant from our culture, are unfortunately still very much part of the narrative of the anti-Semitic narrative of these extreme right groups.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Professor Tolan, for joining me. And as
Thank
I said,
you so much, Nashi.
Okay, and I'll link to the book in the show's notes. Take care.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.